The most expensive mistake a billionaire can make is believing he can measure a person's worth in under 5 seconds. On a rainy Thursday evening in Manhattan, Ethan Callaway believed exactly that. The crystal chandeliers of the Sterling Room painted warm reflections across polished marble floors while executives in tailored suits discussed acquisitions worth hundreds of millions of dollars over aged whiskey and perfectly plated steaks. Ethan sat at the center table near the floor-to-ceiling windows, his presence commanding attention without effort. At 41, he had built one of the largest technology empires in the country. Investors listened when he spoke. Competitors feared when he moved. Employees measured their careers by his approval. And like many powerful men, he had developed a dangerous confidence in his ability to judge people quickly. Across the dining room, Charlotte Bennett carried a tray through the crowded restaurant. Her black uniform was simple. Her blonde hair was tied neatly behind her head. Her movements were efficient and calm, almost invisible among the noise of the evening rush. Most customers never remembered her name. Most never looked long enough to notice the quiet intelligence in her blue eyes. Charlotte preferred it that way. Invisible people were often underestimated. Underestimated people were often left alone. And after everything life had taken from her, peace mattered more than recognition. The evening moved smoothly until one small accident changed everything. A distracted guest backed away from his chair without looking. His shoulder clipped Charlotte as she passed. A few drops of sparkling water splashed onto Ethan Callaway's table. Not enough to damage anything. Not enough to matter. But enough to interrupt a conversation involving several senior executives seated around him. Silence spread across the table. Charlotte immediately reached for a clean cloth. "I'm very sorry, sir," she said calmly. "Let me take care of that." Ethan looked down at the water, then up at the waitress standing beside him. His expression hardened. "You know," he said loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "Attention to detail. Separate successful people from everyone else." A few executives chuckled politely. Charlotte wiped the table without responding. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Then again," he continued, "I suppose that's why some people run companies and some people carry trays." The laughter around the table grew slightly louder. Not cruel, not vicious, just comfortable. The kind of laughter people offered powerful men when they wanted to stay in their good graces. Charlotte stopped moving. For a brief second, the room seemed quieter. The rain tapped softly against the glass behind Ethan. Silverware clinked somewhere in the distance. She slowly placed the cloth down beside his plate. Then she met his eyes. There was no anger in her expression, no embarrassment, no attempt to defend herself, just a calmness that felt strangely out of place. "You're just a waitress," one executive added with a grin, hoping to impress the billionaire. Several people smiled. Charlotte looked at him, then back at Ethan. "No," she said softly. "I'm not just a waitress." Something about the way she said it caused the smiles around the table to fade. Ethan noticed it immediately. Most people either challenged him or submitted to him. Charlotte did neither. She simply stated a fact. Then she turned and walked away. The conversation resumed, but Ethan found himself distracted. Through the rest of the evening, he noticed things he hadn't seen before. The way Charlotte handled difficult customers without losing composure. The way she anticipated requests before guests spoke them aloud. The way she carried herself with quiet confidence despite wearing the same uniform as every other server. She didn't seem intimidated by wealth. She didn't seem impressed by status. And strangely, that bothered him. An hour later, Ethan stood to leave. As he buttoned his jacket, something caught his eye near the edge of the table. A small folded note. No name. No explanation. Just a single handwritten sentence. Ethan opened it casually. The moment he read the words, his expression changed. The color drained slightly from his face. Around him, executives continued gathering their coats, unaware that anything was wrong. Ethan read the sentence again, then a third time. For the first time all evening, the billionaire looked genuinely unsettled. Slowly, he lifted his eyes across the dining room. Charlotte was clearing another table near the far window. She never looked back. She never smiled. She never acknowledged the note. But Ethan understood something in that moment that he had completely missed before. The woman he had dismissed in less than 5 seconds knew something she shouldn't know. And as the rain continued falling over Manhattan, one thought echoed through his mind. Who exactly was Charlotte Bennett? The note contained only 11 words. Check line 47 of tomorrow's merger proposal before signing. Ethan stood motionless beside the table as conversations continued around him. 11 words. Nothing more. Nothing less. Yet the precision unsettled him. Tomorrow morning, his company was scheduled to finalize one of the largest acquisitions of the year. The proposal was confidential. Access was limited to a handful of executives and legal advisors. Charlotte Bennett should not have known it existed. She certainly should not have known enough to reference a specific line. Across the restaurant, she calmly collected empty glasses and stacked plates with the same quiet professionalism she had displayed all evening. Ethan folded the note and slipped it into his jacket pocket. During the drive home, Manhattan blurred beyond the rain-speckled windows of his black sedan. His driver remained silent. Ethan stared at the city lights while replaying every moment from the evening. The accident, the conversation, her response, the note, none of it fit together. By the time he arrived at his penthouse overlooking the Hudson River, curiosity had replaced irritation. He walked directly into his private office instead of heading to bed. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls. Awards, photographs, and framed magazine covers reflected decades of achievement. Yet tonight, none of them held his attention. He opened his laptop and pulled up the acquisition documents scheduled for final approval the next morning. Thousands of pages appeared across multiple files. Ethan moved quickly through the sections until he reached page 47. Then he stopped. His eyes narrowed. A financial adjustment buried deep within a projected cost analysis had been entered incorrectly. The mistake was subtle, small enough to escape a routine review, large enough to cost the company nearly $80 million over 5 years. Ethan leaned back slowly. The room felt unusually quiet. Whoever noticed this error would need advanced business knowledge, strong analytical skills, and access to information they should never have seen. Charlotte was a waitress. At least that was what her uniform suggested. The facts suggested something else entirely. The next morning, Ethan arrived at headquarters before sunrise. The glass tower stood above Midtown like a monument to ambition. Inside the executive conference room, his senior leadership team gathered around a polished walnut table. Coffee steamed from expensive cups. Tablets glowed. Assistants moved efficiently between seats. Ethan listened as the presentation began. 40 minutes later, he interrupted. Go back to page 47. The room grew still. Executives exchanged confused glances. The chief financial officer reopened the section. Ethan pointed toward the projection screen. Explain this adjustment. Silence. Then more silence. Finally, someone noticed the discrepancy. Within minutes, analysts were recalculating projections. Conversations became urgent. Numbers were checked. Assumptions were challenged. When the review concluded, the result was undeniable. The mistake was real. The correction saved the company tens of millions of dollars. One executive shook his head in disbelief. Good catch. Ethan said nothing, because it had not been his catch. For the remainder of the meeting, he found it difficult to focus. Every answer led back to the same question. Who was Charlotte Bennett? That evening, Ethan returned to the Sterling room. He told himself it was to thank her. He told himself it was professional courtesy. Neither explanation was entirely true. When he entered the restaurant, he immediately noticed she was not there. The absence surprised him more than it should have. He waited until the dinner. Rush slowed before approaching the manager. Charlotte Bennett, he said casually. Is she working tonight? The manager smiled. Day off. Ethan nodded. How long has she been here? The manager looked thoughtful. About 3 years. 3 years. Ethan glanced across the dining room where Charlotte had stood the night before. 3 years carrying trays. 3 years taking orders. 3 years hiding something extraordinary in plain sight. As he turned to leave, the manager added one final detail. Strangest thing about Charlotte. Ethan paused. What is that? The manager laughed softly. Every few months some executive, investor, or consultant sits at her table and leaves here looking confused, like they just realized they missed something important. Ethan stepped into the cool Manhattan night. The rain had stopped. The streets shimmered beneath the city lights. And for the first time in many years, the billionaire felt something unfamiliar. Not certainty, not confidence, curiosity. The following afternoon, Ethan canceled 2 meetings, postponed a media interview, and ignored 3 calls from investors waiting for his decision on unrelated deals. None of those things mattered as much as the question that continued following him through every hour of the day. Charlotte Bennett. The name had become an unfinished equation his mind refused to leave alone. By 6 o'clock, he was back at the Sterling Room. The restaurant glowed beneath soft amber lighting as rain clouds drifted over Manhattan once again. This time Charlotte was there. She moved between tables carrying a tray balanced effortlessly on one hand. Her expression remained calm, focused, unhurried. Ethan noticed something else. People seemed comfortable around her. Elderly couples smiled when she approached. Business travelers relaxed. Even impatient customers lowered their voices. It was as though she carried a quiet gravity that changed the atmosphere around her. Ethan chose a table near the back. Not his usual table. Not the center of attention. He wanted to observe. For nearly 20 minutes, Charlotte never looked in his direction. She treated him exactly like every other customer. Eventually she approached with a notepad. "Good evening, Mr. Calloway." Her voice was professional. Warm. Nothing more. Ethan looked up. "You knew I would come back." Charlotte smiled faintly. People usually come back when they have unanswered questions. Ethan studied her face. "You knew about the merger document." "Did I?" she asked. The note mentioned a specific page. And was the note correct? Ethan paused. "Yes." "Then perhaps that is the important part." She stood quietly waiting to take his order. Ethan felt the conversation slipping beyond his control, something that rarely happened. "How did you know?" he asked. Charlotte glanced toward another table where a family needed refills. "Would you like to order dinner first?" Ethan almost laughed. Most people rushed to answer his questions. Charlotte redirected them. "Fine," he said. "Steak. Medium rare." "Very good." She wrote it down. "And Charlotte." She stopped. "Yes. You still have not answered me." For a moment, she seemed to consider something. Then she said, "Sometimes people notice things because they are paying attention." Before Ethan could respond, she walked away. The answer frustrated him. Yet somehow it also intrigued him more. An hour later, his meal was nearly finished when an elderly man entered the restaurant carrying a worn umbrella. The host greeted him immediately. Several employees smiled. Charlotte noticed him from across the room, and her entire expression softened. She excused herself from another table and crossed the restaurant. Ethan watched carefully. The old man wore a faded jacket and carried himself with the careful movements of someone who had spent decades working hard. Charlotte greeted him warmly and guided him to a quiet corner table. Then something unexpected happened. She sat down. Not for long. Just a minute. But she sat and listened as he spoke. The old man laughed. Charlotte laughed too. It was the first genuine laugh Ethan had seen from her. Curious, he called over the manager. "Who is he?" The manager followed Ethan's gaze. "Mr. Walters. A friend." "More than that." The manager smiled. When Charlotte first started here, she was struggling. Mr. Walters came in every Tuesday, ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, left the biggest tips. Ethan looked back toward the corner table. "Family. No, just kindness." The manager's expression grew thoughtful. "Funny thing is, a year later Mr. Walters lost his apartment after some medical problems. Charlotte helped him find housing, helped with paperwork, helped with everything." Ethan remained silent. "She does things like that," the manager continued. "Never talks about it. Never asks for credit." Across the room, Charlotte stood and returned to work. Mr. Walters smiled as she walked away. Ethan felt an unfamiliar sensation settle over him. Respect. Not because she had spotted an accounting error. Not because she seemed intelligent. But because every new piece of information pointed in the same direction. Character. Real character. The kind that existed when nobody was watching. As he prepared to leave, Charlotte brought the check. Ethan looked at her for several seconds. "You know," he said quietly, "most people spend years trying to impress me." Charlotte placed the bill on the table. "That sounds exhausting." Ethan laughed despite himself. "You really do not care who I am, do you?" Charlotte considered the question carefully. Then she answered in a way he would remember for years. "I care who people are, Mr. Calloway. I just do not care how much money they have." For the second time in less than a week, Ethan found himself completely without a response. 3 days later, Ethan decided to stop asking questions and start looking for answers. It was not a habit he enjoyed. Throughout his career, information usually arrived before he needed it. Analysts prepared reports. Advisors provided context. Entire departments existed to eliminate uncertainty. Yet Charlotte Bennett remained frustratingly difficult to understand. Every fact he uncovered only created more questions. On Monday morning, he instructed his executive assistant to compile a background profile. By lunchtime, a thin folder sat on his desk. Ethan opened it expecting clarity. Instead, he found contradictions. Charlotte Bennett, age 28, resident of Manhattan, employed at the Sterling Room for 3 years. No criminal record, no lawsuits, no public scandals, nothing remarkable, nothing that explained how a waitress could identify an $80 million financial error hidden inside confidential merger documents. Ethan closed the folder. It felt incomplete, not because information was missing, because the most important parts of her story seemed invisible. Later that afternoon, another opportunity appeared unexpectedly. His company hosted a private charity luncheon benefiting educational scholarships. The event attracted executives, investors, politicians, and community leaders. Hundreds attended every year. As Ethan entered the ballroom, conversations filled the air beneath sparkling chandeliers. Then he stopped. Across the room stood Charlotte. She was not wearing a restaurant uniform. Instead, she wore a simple navy dress and a modest silver necklace. Nothing extravagant, nothing designed to attract attention. Yet somehow she looked completely different. Not because of her clothes, because she belonged there. She spoke comfortably with nonprofit directors and scholarship recipients. She listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, remembered names. Ethan watched from a distance. The more he observed, the stranger everything became. Finally, curiosity won. He crossed the room. Charlotte noticed him approaching, but showed no surprise. Mr. Calloway. Charlotte. Ethan glanced around. I did not expect to see you here. I volunteer with the Scholarship Foundation. For how long? Almost 4 years. Ethan blinked. For years. Longer than she had worked at the restaurant. You never mentioned that. Charlotte smiled softly. You never asked. Before Ethan could respond, the foundation director approached. An older woman named Rebecca Langford. Her face brightened immediately when she saw Charlotte. There you are. Rebecca turned toward Ethan. I hope she is not causing trouble. Not yet, Ethan said. Rebecca laughed. Charlotte saved this foundation. Ethan looked at Charlotte. Saved it? Rebecca nodded enthusiastically. 5 years ago, we nearly lost our funding structure. Nobody could figure out why donations were declining despite increased participation. Charlotte analyzed everything and redesigned the entire strategy. Ethan stared at her. You did that? Charlotte looked slightly embarrassed. It was a team effort. Rebecca shook her head. That is what she always says. Then Rebecca was called away by another guest. The conversation ended. But the damage was done. Ethan's curiosity had grown into genuine fascination. You redesigned a statewide scholarship program? Charlotte looked toward the stage where students prepared to receive awards. The students mattered. The system needed help. Ethan shook his head slowly. Do you realize how unusual you are? Charlotte laughed quietly. That sounds dangerously close to a compliment. It was not meant as one. Good. Her eyes sparkled with amusement. I would not want you becoming predictable. For the first time, Ethan found himself laughing with her instead of analyzing her. The feeling caught him off guard. Then the event host stepped onto the stage. Applause filled the ballroom. Scholarship recipients were invited forward one by one. Ethan returned to his reserved table near the front. Charlotte moved toward the side of the room. Minutes later, the host began recognizing major contributors who had helped build the foundation. Several names received applause. Then came a final announcement. There is one person who never allows us to publicly acknowledge her contributions, the host said. But today we are making an exception. Charlotte froze. Ethan noticed immediately. Over the past 4 years, this individual has personally funded scholarships for dozens of students while requesting complete anonymity. Tonight, we simply want to say thank you. The spotlight moved across the ballroom. It stopped on Charlotte Bennett. The room erupted into applause. Ethan sat perfectly still. Around him, hundreds of people stood. Students cheered. Educators smiled. Charlotte looked genuinely uncomfortable as she quietly accepted the recognition. And in that moment, Ethan realized something that unsettled him far more than the mysterious note or the merger correction. He had spent years measuring success by wealth, influence, and achievement. Charlotte seemed to measure success by entirely different standards. And somehow, those standards felt much harder to reach. The applause lasted nearly a full minute. Charlotte stood beneath the spotlight looking as though she wished it would disappear. She accepted the recognition with a small smile, thanked the foundation in a few simple words, and returned to her seat as quickly as possible. Most people would have used the moment to tell their story. Charlotte seemed determined to avoid becoming the story. Ethan watched her throughout the remainder of the evening. The more he learned, the less everything made sense. Wealthy people often donated money. Successful people often volunteered. Intelligent people often solved difficult problems. Charlotte somehow managed to do all three while spending her evenings carrying trays in a restaurant. 2 days later, Ethan found himself back at the Sterling Room again. This time he arrived earlier than usual. The restaurant had not yet reached the rush of dinner service. Soft jazz floated through the room. Rain tapped gently against the windows. Charlotte was arranging silverware near the bar when she noticed him. "You are becoming a regular customer," she said. Ethan took his seat. "I am beginning to suspect you planned that." Charlotte laughed quietly. "Trust me, if I were planning anything, it would involve fewer questions." She handed him a menu. Ethan did not open it. "Why do you work here?" Charlotte blinked. "Because they pay me." "You know that is not what I mean." She studied him for a moment. "And what exactly do you think I should be doing?" Ethan leaned back. "Running a company, leading a foundation, consulting, teaching, almost anything other than waiting tables." Charlotte looked around the restaurant. "Do you know what I like about this job?" Ethan shook his head. "At the end of every shift, I know whether I helped someone." It is surprisingly difficult to say that about many professions. Ethan found himself unable to argue. Before he could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew attention. Several executives entered carrying briefcases and laptops. Ethan immediately recognized them. They worked for one of his largest competitors. The group requested a table near the center of the dining room. Charlotte was assigned to their section. Ethan watched with mild curiosity. 40 minutes later, the curiosity turned into surprise. One of the executives accidentally left a folder on the table while the group stepped outside to take a phone call. The folder remained unattended. Thick, confidential, important. Charlotte noticed it immediately. She picked it up and carried it directly to the host's stand for safekeeping. No hesitation. No interest in what might be inside. Nothing. 10 minutes later, the executive returned in a panic. Relief flooded his face when Charlotte handed it back. Ethan observed the entire exchange from across the room. Most people would have at least looked. Most people would have been tempted. Charlotte treated the folder exactly as she would have treated a forgotten umbrella. When her section quieted, Ethan called her over. "You never opened it." Charlotte looked confused. "Why would I?" "Because it belonged to one of the most powerful firms in the country. It still was not mine." Ethan shook his head slowly. "Do you always make integrity sound effortless?" Charlotte smiled. "No. Usually people make it sound more complicated than it is." Later that evening, as Ethan prepared to leave, the restaurant owner approached his table. The older man greeted Ethan warmly before glancing toward Charlotte. "She is remarkable, is she not?" Ethan followed his gaze. "You could say that." The owner smiled. "You know, 3 different companies have tried to hire her away from here." Ethan looked up sharply. 3, at least." "And she said no?" The owner nodded. "Every time." Ethan stared across the dining room where Charlotte was helping a young employee learn the reservation system. She was patient, encouraging, completely unaware that she was being watched. For the first time, a possibility entered Ethan's mind that had never occurred to him before. Maybe Charlotte Bennett was not working at the restaurant because she lacked better opportunities. Maybe she was there because she had chosen a life according to values he still did not fully understand. And somehow that possibility fascinated him more than every mystery that had come before. The following week brought an opportunity neither of them expected. Ethan's company faced a growing problem that no executive seemed able to solve. A major community development initiative designed to support small businesses across several New York neighborhoods had stalled. Meetings produced reports. Reports produced recommendations. Recommendations produced more meetings. Yet nothing changed. Participation continued declining. Public trust continued fading. One rainy afternoon, Ethan sat in a conference room listening to another presentation filled with charts and projections. Around the table, experienced consultants debated strategies worth millions of dollars. 2 hours later, nobody had a solution. Ethan stared through the glass wall overlooking Manhattan. Then an unexpected thought entered his mind. That evening, he arrived at the Sterling room carrying a slim folder beneath his arm. Charlotte noticed it immediately. "That looks dangerous," she said while setting down a glass of water. Ethan smiled. "It is a community development proposal." "Exactly my point." Ethan opened the folder. "Would you look at something for me?" Charlotte folded her arms. "I thought you hired experts for that." "I did. And they have not helped." A faint smile appeared on her face. "That must be difficult for them." Ethan slid the folder across the table. "Just 5 minutes." Charlotte hesitated before opening it. Her eyes moved across the pages. Slowly, carefully, the restaurant continued buzzing around them. Plates clinked. Conversations drifted through the air. Rain tapped softly against the windows. After several minutes, Charlotte closed the folder. "You are solving the wrong problem." Ethan leaned forward. "Go on. Your proposal focuses on funding." She tapped the document. "But people are not leaving because of funding. They are leaving because they do not trust the process anymore." Ethan frowned. "The surveys do not say that." "The surveys were written by people inside the system." Charlotte handed the folder back. "Go talk to the business owners who stopped participating. Not the ones who stayed. The ones who left." Ethan remained silent. Charlotte continued. "People tell you why they joined. People who leave tell you why they lost faith." For several seconds, Ethan simply stared at her. The answer felt obvious now. Simple. Human. Yet nobody in the conference room had suggested it. The following day, Ethan followed her advice. He spent hours meeting former participants, listening instead of presenting, asking instead of persuading. By evening, a pattern emerged. Charlotte had been right. Every single time. The problem had never been financial. It had been trust. 3 weeks later, the redesigned initiative launched successfully. Participation increased. Community leaders returned. Local business owners publicly praised the changes. The project became one of the company's most celebrated achievements of the year. During the board meeting announcing the results, several executives congratulated Ethan on his leadership. He accepted the praise politely. But afterward, as the conference room emptied, he found himself looking out across the city skyline with an uncomfortable realization. Charlotte had solved the problem in less than 10 minutes. Not because she was smarter than everyone else in the room. Because she saw people before she saw systems. That evening he returned to the restaurant carrying something unusual. Not a proposal. Not a question. Not another mystery. An envelope. Charlotte approached his table. "Good evening." Ethan slid the envelope toward her. "What is this?" "Open it." She did. Her expression changed immediately. Inside was an official offer letter. Senior strategic advisor. Flexible schedule. Extraordinary compensation. Full benefits. Complete autonomy. Charlotte looked up slowly. Ethan met her eyes. "You could make a bigger impact in 1 year than most people make in a lifetime." The restaurant seemed quieter somehow. Charlotte studied the document for several moments. Then she folded it carefully. Ethan waited. For the first time since meeting her, he felt nervous. Not about a merger. Not about a negotiation. About an answer. Charlotte placed the envelope back on the table. Her voice remained gentle. Respectful. Certain. "It is a generous offer." Ethan smiled. "Then say yes." Charlotte shook her head. "I cannot." The smile disappeared. "Why?" She glanced around the restaurant. At the young server learning her first week on the job. At Mr. Walters reading quietly in his usual corner booth. At the families sharing dinner together. Then she looked back at Ethan. "Because 3 months ago," she said softly, "another company made me an even better offer." Ethan froze. "And?" Charlotte smiled. "I turned that one down too." For the first time in his career, Ethan Callaway had no counteroffer. No negotiation strategy. No leverage. He sat quietly while Charlotte's words settled between them. Another company had offered her more. She had refused. The explanation he expected never came. Instead, she simply picked up a tray and continued working as though she had not just stunned one of the most successful businessmen in the country. Ethan remained at the table long after his coffee had gone cold. That night, the city looked different from the back seat of his car. Manhattan's lights reflected across rain-dark streets while pedestrians hurried beneath umbrellas. Normally, Ethan used the drive home to review numbers, answer messages, or prepare for meetings. Tonight, he stared out the window in silence. One question followed him all the way back to his penthouse. What was Charlotte choosing that everyone else was missing? The answer arrived unexpectedly a week later. On a Saturday morning, Ethan attended the opening ceremony for a new community center funded by several local organizations. His company had contributed financially, so his presence was expected. Cameras flashed. Reporters gathered. Politicians delivered speeches. Everything unfolded exactly as planned. Then Ethan noticed a familiar face near the back of the crowd. Charlotte stood beside a group of teenagers carrying boxes of supplies into the building. No spotlight followed her. No reporters approached her. Most people seemed unaware she was even there. Curious, Ethan stepped away from the ceremony and crossed the parking lot. As he approached, he realized the teenagers knew her well. They greeted her by name. They laughed with her. They listened when she spoke. One young girl ran up holding a college acceptance letter. Charlotte hugged her warmly. The girl's eyes filled with tears. Ethan stopped a few feet away. He did not want to interrupt. An older woman standing nearby noticed him watching. She helped that girl get into school, the woman said proudly. Ethan glanced toward her. Charlotte. The woman nodded. And about 20 others over the years. Ethan looked back at the teenagers. She volunteers here? The woman smiled. Every Saturday. Sometimes every Sunday too. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. Not guilt. Not envy. Perspective. The ceremony continued behind him. Important people delivered important speeches about changing lives. Meanwhile, Charlotte was quietly changing lives without standing near a microphone. Later that afternoon, he finally found an opportunity to speak with her alone. They sat on a bench overlooking a small basketball court where children played beneath the autumn sun. For several moments, neither spoke. The sounds of laughter drifted through the air. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. Why did you turn down the offers? Charlotte watched the children for a moment before answering. Because they were offering me jobs I did not want. Ethan frowned. Most people would call those opportunities. Most people might be right. She smiled softly. But opportunity and purpose are not always the same thing. Ethan considered that. You could help more people with the resources those jobs provide. Charlotte nodded. Maybe. Then she pointed toward the court. Do you see that boy in the red jacket? Ethan followed her gaze. A young teenager was helping a smaller child tie a loose shoelace. 3 years ago, he was failing nearly every class, Charlotte said. Now he tutors younger students after school. Ethan remained silent. That girl over there? Charlotte continued. First person in her family preparing to attend college. The afternoon breeze moved gently through the trees. Charlotte smiled as she watched the students. I already have everything I need, Ethan. For a moment, he forgot about stock prices, quarterly reports, and billion-dollar valuations. He simply sat there listening. And for perhaps the first time in many years, the billionaire began to wonder whether success might be measured by something far greater than achievement alone. The conversation on the bench stayed with Ethan long after the sun disappeared behind the Manhattan skyline. Over the following weeks, he found himself noticing things he had ignored for years. He noticed how often executives talked about impact without ever meeting the people affected by their decisions. He noticed how frequently success was measured in numbers alone. Most of all, he noticed how different Charlotte's world seemed from his own. One evening, nearly 2 months after their first unexpected encounter, Ethan arrived at the Sterling Room carrying no documents, no proposals, and no hidden agenda. The restaurant was busy as usual. Crystal glasses reflected warm light. Conversations floated through the room. Charlotte was helping a new server organize orders during the dinner rush. She moved with the same calm confidence she always carried. When she finally approached his table, she smiled. You seem unusually relaxed tonight. Ethan laughed softly. I am trying something new. Should I be concerned? Probably. Charlotte set down a glass of water. That is not reassuring. For a moment, neither spoke. The comfortable silence surprised Ethan. Months earlier, he would have filled every pause with questions. Now he simply appreciated her presence. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. The message came from a senior executive. A photograph was attached. Ethan opened it. His expression immediately changed. Charlotte noticed. Everything okay? Ethan looked up. You remember that competitor who offered you a position? Charlotte nodded. Yes. Apparently, they just announced a major restructuring. Charlotte waited. Ethan turned the screen toward her. The article revealed the company was eliminating multiple departments and replacing several leadership teams. The position they had offered Charlotte no longer existed. Charlotte read the headline quietly. Then she handed the phone back. That is unfortunate. Ethan stared at her. That is your reaction? What should my reaction be? You turned down an opportunity worth millions. Charlotte smiled. Then it sounds like I avoided a problem worth millions. Ethan laughed despite himself. The answer was so perfectly Charlotte that it left him shaking his head. Yet the moment also triggered another realization. Every major decision she had made appeared irrational from the outside. Yet somehow those decisions kept proving correct. A week later, Ethan learned why. The discovery happened completely by accident. He attended a private gathering hosted by several business leaders and nonprofit organizations. During a discussion about education funding, one of the guests mentioned a name Ethan had never heard before: Bennett Scholars Initiative. The room immediately responded with admiration. Several executives praised the program. Others discussed its success helping first-generation college students. Curious, Ethan asked a simple question. Who founded it? The room grew quiet. Then an older philanthropist smiled. You do not know? Ethan shook his head. Charlotte Bennett. Ethan stared at him. Charlotte founded it. Almost 6 years ago. The man nodded. One of the most effective private scholarship networks in the state. Ethan felt completely stunned. How large is it? The answer left him speechless. Over 600 students had received support. Dozens had graduated from universities. Many had returned to mentor younger participants. The initiative operated quietly, efficiently, and almost entirely outside public attention. Nobody had ever connected it to the waitress working evenings at a Manhattan restaurant. Ethan spent the rest of the night listening in disbelief. Piece by piece, a larger picture emerged. Charlotte had never walked away from opportunity. She had built her own. She had never rejected success. She had simply defined it differently. The next evening, Ethan returned to the restaurant. Rain drifted softly beyond the windows. Charlotte arrived at his table carrying coffee. Before she could speak, Ethan looked at her and said, 600 students. Charlotte froze. Just slightly. Barely noticeable. But enough. I'm not sure what you mean. Ethan smiled. I think you know exactly what I mean. For several seconds, Charlotte said nothing. Then she sat across from him. Something she had never done before. The restaurant continued moving around them. Plates clinked. Conversations rose and fell. Yet the moment felt strangely still. Ethan looked at her with genuine admiration. You never told me. Charlotte glanced toward the rain outside. You never asked the right question. And for the third time since meeting her, Ethan found himself completely without words. Charlotte sat quietly across from Ethan while rain traced silver lines down the restaurant windows. For a few moments, neither spoke. The dining room buzzed softly around them, but the noise felt distant. Ethan looked at her differently now. Not as a mystery to solve. Not as a talented waitress hiding unusual skills. For the first time, he saw the full picture. A woman who had built something extraordinary without asking anyone to notice. A woman who had changed hundreds of lives while carrying plates and pouring coffee. A woman who never once used her accomplishments to impress anyone. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. You could have told people. Charlotte smiled gently. Why? Because what you built is remarkable. She looked toward the rain. The students mattered. The recognition did not. Ethan shook his head in quiet disbelief. Do you realize how rare that is? Charlotte laughed softly. Probably about as rare as a billionaire sitting in the same restaurant every week because he is trying to understand a waitress. Ethan laughed too. The truth landed harder than he expected. Months earlier, he had believed success meant being the smartest person in the room, the most accomplished, the most influential. Charlotte had challenged every one of those assumptions without ever trying to. Over the following weeks, their conversations continued. Not every night, not even every week, but often enough. Sometimes they discussed education, sometimes business, sometimes nothing important at all. Yet each conversation left Ethan thinking long after it ended. One cold December evening, he arrived at the Sterling room and immediately noticed something unusual. Charlotte was not working. Her section was covered by another server. The manager greeted him with a smile. Looking for Charlotte? Ethan hesitated. Maybe. The manager chuckled. She is at the scholarship center tonight. Graduation ceremony. Without thinking, Ethan turned around and left the restaurant. 40 minutes later, he found himself standing quietly in the back of a community auditorium. The room was filled with students and families. Proud parents held cameras. Teachers smiled from the front rows. On stage, graduates accepted certificates and scholarships. Charlotte stood near the side wall, applauding every student. She was not on stage. She was not giving a speech. Most people in the room had no idea she had helped make the entire event possible. Ethan watched as one young woman approached Charlotte after receiving her award. Tears filled her eyes. She hugged Charlotte tightly. Then another student approached. Then another. Soon a line formed. One by one they thanked her. Some spoke about college. Others spoke about new careers. One young man simply said, "I would not be here without you." Charlotte smiled and encouraged each of them. Nothing dramatic. Nothing theatrical. Just quiet kindness. Ethan felt something shift inside him. For years he had been surrounded by applause directed at success. Tonight, he was witnessing gratitude directed at service. The difference was profound. After the ceremony ended, Charlotte finally noticed him standing near the exit. Surprise crossed her face. "What are you doing here?" Ethan looked around the room. Families laughed. Students celebrated. Teachers embraced former pupils. "Learning," he answered honestly. Charlotte smiled. Outside, snow had begun falling lightly over Manhattan. The city glowed beneath holiday lights. For a moment, they stood together watching people leave the building. Then Ethan reached into his coat pocket and handed her a folded envelope. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. Another job offer? No. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single handwritten note. Charlotte read it once. Then again. The note contained only one sentence. "Thank you for teaching me the difference between success and value." For the first time in months, Charlotte seemed genuinely speechless. Ethan smiled. "When we first met, I thought I understood people." Snow drifted softly through the cold evening air. Charlotte folded the note and slipped it into her pocket. And now, Ethan looked at the students celebrating across the street. Then at the woman who had quietly changed his understanding of success. "Now I know I still have a lot to learn." Charlotte smiled. Neither said anything else. They did not need to. Because sometimes the most important lessons arrive without announcements. Without titles. Without recognition. Sometimes they arrive wearing an ordinary uniform. And the people who change the world rarely feel the need to tell anyone they are extraordinary.